I've always loved the quiet solitude of my late-night walks. The streets, usually buzzing with life, are empty, and there's a strange comfort in being alone with my thoughts. Tonight, however, felt different. The air was heavy, and an unsettling stillness hung over the neighborhood as if the night itself was holding its breath. It started when I turned onto Pinewood Avenue, a route I'd taken countless times before. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and curl unnaturally. I chalked it up to faulty wiring, but a chill ran down my spine. The houses lining the street were dark, their windows reflecting nothing but void. Most of the families had likely gone to bed, but one house stood out. A faint orange glow flickered from a second-floor window, reminiscent of a candle. It wasn't the light itself that unnerved me, but the way it seemed to sway, almost rhythmically, as though someone was carrying it. "It's probably nothing," I muttered under my breath, quickening my pace. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't the sound of footsteps or the echo of my own movement. It was sharper, more deliberate, like fingernails drumming against glass. I stopped and looked around, but the street was empty. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. A single shadow moved across the street, far too quickly to belong to anything natural. It darted behind a parked car and disappeared. My breath hitched. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. Silence answered. I forced myself to keep walking, refusing to look back again. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the very air was pressing down on me. The tapping sound had stopped, but in its absence came another, a faint whispering. It was so quiet, I almost convinced myself it was the wind. Almost. The whispering grew louder as I approached the end of the street. It wasn't words exactly, but a series of guttural sounds, like someone trying to speak through clenched teeth. I clenched my fists, willing myself to stay calm. When I turned the corner onto Elm Street, the sound stopped abruptly, as though cut off by an unseen hand. I exhaled in relief, but the feeling was short-lived. There, at the far end of the street, was a figure. It stood motionless in the pale light of a flickering street lamp. Its silhouette was human-like, but something about it was wrong. Its limbs were too long, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me, piercing through the darkness. I'm not proud of it, but I froze. My legs felt like lead, my mind racing with thoughts of what this thing could be. The rational part of me screamed to run, but a primal fear rooted me in place. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky, like a puppet on tangled strings. Then, another step, and another. That's when I ran. I bolted down the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of footsteps followed, heavy and uneven, matching the erratic rhythm of my pounding heart. I didn't dare look back, too terrified of what I might see. Instead, I focused on the glow of a convenience store at the next intersection, a beacon of safety. As I reached the store, I threw myself against the glass door and stumbled inside. The fluorescent lights were harsh and blinding after the darkness of the street. A bored-looking clerk glanced up from his phone, clearly unimpressed by my dramatic entrance. "You okay, buddy?" he asked, his voice tinged with annoyance. "There's someone out there," I panted, pointing toward the door. The clerk frowned and walked over to look outside. "I don't see anyone," he said after a moment. I turned to look, and sure enough, the street was empty. No figure, no flickering streetlights, just the quiet stillness of the night. My body sagged with relief, though a lingering unease gnawed at the edges of my mind. "Maybe I imagined it," I muttered, mostly to myself. The clerk shrugged and returned to his post, clearly uninterested in my paranoia. I stayed in the store for a while, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Eventually, I decided to head home. The streets were as silent as before, but I didn't see or hear anything unusual. I reached my front door without incident and quickly locked it behind me, double-checking the bolt for good measure. As I turned to head to bed, my eyes caught something on the living room window. A handprint. It was smeared and elongated, almost inhuman, and it was on the inside of the glass. I wasn't alone. It started with a simple decision to take a walk. The weight of the day had left me restless, and the silence of the empty house only amplified the unease simmering in the back of my mind. I told myself the fresh air would help, that I'd clear my head and be back in no time. It was past midnight and the streets were quiet, too quiet. Even the usual hum of distant traffic seemed muted, like the world had collectively decided to hold its breath. I shoved my hands into my jacket pockets as a cold breeze swept through the empty neighborhood. The familiar streets I had walked countless times in daylight now felt alien under the dim glow of scattered streetlights. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and every creak of a tree branch made me flinch. I tried to rationalize the discomfort. It's just the night playing tricks on me, I thought. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. As I turned onto a side street, I noticed something odd. A faint scraping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath to listen more closely. The sound stopped too. My pulse quickened. Was it just my imagination? I shook off the unease and kept walking, picking up my pace slightly. The sound started again, closer this time. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the street was empty. The only movement came from the wind rustling the leaves. My stomach tightened as I turned back and kept moving, my steps quick and uneven. The sound stopped following me, or so I thought. When I reached the park at the end of the street, I heard it again, louder this time. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The noise seemed to come from the path ahead, just out of sight beyond the curve of the trail. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I was frozen, caught between curiosity and fear. I took a cautious step forward, and the sound stopped once more. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The word echoed into the void, swallowed by the night. No response. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a stray dog dragging something along the path. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The rhythm of the sound was too deliberate, too human. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight as I approached the bend. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. Just the empty trail lined with skeletal trees. Then I saw it, a shadow darting across the path, quick and fluid, vanishing into the trees. My breath hitched, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. Again, no response. Suddenly, the smell hit me, a sickly metallic odor, sharp and overwhelming. It clung to the air, making my stomach churn. I covered my nose and backed away, but my foot caught on something, and I stumbled. When I aimed the flashlight down, I saw it, a long, deep scratch etched into the pavement, like something sharp had been dragged across it. Panic set in, and I turned to run, but my flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with the phone, my fingers trembling as I tried to turn it back on. Before I could, I heard a voice, a whisper, faint and raspy, coming from the trees. "Don't go." I froze. The voice was barely audible, but the desperation in it was unmistakable. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused to move. "What do you want?" I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows. Its outline was humanoid, but its movements were unnatural, jerky, and fragmented, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. The metallic smell grew stronger as it approached, and I realized with horror that its hands, or what should have been hands, ended in long, jagged claws. It stopped just short of the beam of light spilling from a distant street lamp. I couldn't make out its face, but I felt its gaze, heavy and oppressive, boring into me. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, its voice echoing unnaturally. My survival instincts finally kicked in, and I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the pavement. I didn't dare look back, even as the scraping sound resumed, this time faster, more frantic, chasing me down. I ran until my lungs burned, until I reached the safety of my house and slammed the door behind me. The scraping sound stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I peered out the window, half expecting to see the figure standing on the sidewalk. But the street was empty, as if nothing had ever been there. I tried to convince myself it was over, that I was safe. But as I backed away from the window, I saw it, a deep scratch etched into the wood of the door, fresh and deliberate. I've always hated driving late at night, but I had no choice. My shift had run long, and the shortcut home took me through a stretch of desolate back roads surrounded by dense woods. The route saved time, but the eerie stillness of the place always left me unsettled. Tonight was no different. The road was pitch black, illuminated only by the weak beams of my headlights. The rhythmic hum of the tires was the only sound, broken occasionally by the rustling of branches in the wind. I turned up the music to drown out the uneasy silence, but it didn't help. There was something about the road tonight that felt wrong. It started subtly, a shadow darting across the edge of my vision. I brushed it off as an animal, maybe a deer. But then there was another, and another. Every few minutes, I caught something moving in the trees, just beyond the reach of my headlights. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the gnawing unease in my chest refused to go away. I kept driving, gripping the wheel tighter with each passing mile. The road seemed longer than usual, the landmarks I used to track my progress nowhere in sight. Then, the radio crackled. The music distorted into a garbled mess of static and faint whispers. I turned it off, but the whispers didn't stop. They were faint, like a conversation just out of earshot. I tried to focus on the road, but the whispers grew louder. Words began to form, incomprehensible, yet chilling. My breath quickened, and I glanced in the rearview mirror. At first, I saw nothing, but as I stared, the darkness seemed to shift. A shape began to emerge, an outline of a figure seated in the back seat. My chest tightened. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. Whipping around, I found the back seat empty. My hands trembled as I tried to steady my breathing. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded hollow. "You're just tired." But when I faced forward again, my blood ran cold. Standing in the middle of the road was a woman. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the dim light, and her long black hair hung limply over her shoulders. She wore a tattered white dress, and her eyes were dark voids, endless and empty. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. She raised a hand and pointed at me. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, the whispers returned, louder now, as if they were all around me. I snapped out of my trance and slammed the car into reverse. The woman didn't move, didn't flinch as my headlights swept over her. The car lurched backward, and I nearly lost control as I spun the wheel trying to turn around. When I finally managed to face the other direction, I hit the gas, desperate to get away. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, a tunnel of darkness and trees. My hands shook on the wheel, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her standing there. Instead, she was closer. She wasn't running or walking. She was just there, appearing in flashes as if the darkness itself carried her forward. My heart pounded against my ribs, and I pressed the pedal harder. The car groaned in protest, but I didn't care. I just needed to get off this cursed road. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping into a cacophony of voices, each one calling my name. The shadows on the edges of the road seemed to close in, pressing against the car. I could barely see, barely think. My world was the road, the whispers, and her. And then silence. The road ended abruptly, spilling me onto a familiar street. The forest was gone, replaced by streetlights and the quiet hum of a sleeping neighborhood. I pulled over and sat there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. When I finally looked in the rearview mirror, I was alone. Or so I thought. As I turned the corner toward home, I glanced in the mirror one last time. My stomach dropped. There, faint but unmistakable, was the woman's reflection. She wasn't behind the car anymore. She was in the passenger seat, staring at me with those empty, hollow eyes.